Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is March the 23rd, 2015, and the show is being recorded on March the 22nd, 2015. So bear that in mind as you pay attention to what we're going to be talking about tonight. Things can change rapidly over a few days or so in terms of real time, in terms of events that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about a number of different issues tonight. We're going to talk about Iran. We're going to talk about Syria, Iraq, of course. We'll try to get into Russia. We'll try to get into the idea that Obama is attempting to mandate voting now. He's mandated private insurance, and now he's going to mandate voting. Mandatory voting as well. I guess we'll be seeing mandatory civil service and mandatory vaccines coming very soon. In fact, we'll try to touch on that as well. Got a lot of stuff to talk about tonight, and of course, we are going to try to get into a number of other issues if we have time. Now, for those of you who are just joining us tonight for the first time, I'd like to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you'll find the archive versions of this show. You'll find the links to my more recent articles posted up there on the left-hand side. You'll find the chat room available and, of course, the live stream. And if you're interested in finding my work as it comes out, then there's a number of different websites you can go to see that work, and it is activistpost.com where most of my work is posted. And you can also go to naturalblaze.com. You can go to theantimedia.org here in the future, and you'll see some articles that post up there as well. Now, if you're interested in my work specifically, then I would remind you to go to brandonturbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives, of the interviews, all that kind of stuff is posted up at brandonturbeville.com, as well as the books. If you're interested in the books, they are available there, 6 books. You click on the Books tab. You can see how to buy them easily. And, of course, the events page that is located there as well. I'll go ahead and tell you right now, we plan a lot of updates. We plan to revamp the website at some point in the future, and of course, at some point, it would be great to have the opportunity and the time to be able to put these some more books together, because the material is there. I should say the material is there, but I unfortunately do not have the time with the events that are transpiring, with so many other things that are going on, that I don't have the time to sit down and put these books out. But we hope to be able to do that in the near future. Hope to be able to get a little more organized and get these things out there. So bear that in mind as we move forward. And you can expect some positive changes coming, some more improvements, I guess we should say, upgrades. Now, I said at the beginning of the year in 2015 that this is what we're going to try to do, that we were going to try to reach out and touch more people in the local area. This operation is going to do that, and we hope that your operation is going to do that as well. So I want to remind you of that on March 23rd, that this is the course of action that we're trying to take, is that we're trying to reach out into our own communities and do whatever we can, utilize whatever we can to do that. Not so much worried about competing with one another on the internet, although the internet, of course, is going to play a major role, but we're going to try to focus on doing things locally. And whatever you do, just try to get out and do it in your local area. And if that avenue is not available to you, then try to make that avenue available. So just bear that in mind, and we'll have hopefully some more events coming up to talk about. We'll hopefully have a number of other things coming up in the near future as well. So let's move on into the information. I want to bring something up that's taking place in North Carolina right now. There's apparently a bill entitled SB 346 that is attempting to remove religious exemptions for vaccines. So in the case of many of these, most states actually have religious exemptions and philosophical exemptions. Most states have removed philosophical exemptions, but religious exemptions are still there. So they're attempting to remove the religious exemptions, and that will be your last legal method of resistance. Now, first of all, let me point out, if the government tells you that you have to give your child a vaccine, you tell the government to shove it. Your child's health is not worth obeying the damn law. Okay? Get that through your head. There should be no question about what will I do if they pass a law that mandates that I have to vaccinate my child. That should not be an option. You're not going to vaccinate your child. That should be the answer. The only option then is what you do after you don't vaccinate your child. Okay, so we shouldn't let this go far. We should, of course, fight this bill. It's going to be fast-tracked. I think it's set for August 2015. The bill is SB 346 in North Carolina. There's a video up on Activist Post by Kenny Valenzuela. Go check that video out and make the appropriate action. Okay, you can tell your representatives that if they do this, if they pass or vote for this bill, they won't be there next year. And listen, if they do this, don't just send in idle threats. Okay, make sure that you follow through. You see, the power structure understands that most people make idle threats. The power structure becomes a little more worried when people begin to follow through on their word. So don't just tell a politician, if you support this bill to eliminate health rights or gun rights, etc., then we'll campaign against you or we'll vote against you in the next election. You need to go out there and vote against them now. You start that campaign immediately. Let these parasites know that if they continue to violate your rights, that you're going to do something about it. And of course, if you are faced with any type of mandatory vaccination situation, if an authority figure approaches you and attempts to force you to vaccinate yourself or your children, if there is threat of the force of taking away your children from you for the purpose of vaccination, or because you didn't vaccinate, well then you have to resist that. Okay, by any means necessary, and I make that clear. Any means necessary, because this is not a debate. You do not have to vaccinate your children, and anybody who tries to forcibly do that to you or your children, that is your enemy. That's about as simple as I can put it. Now, we're going to move on. I want to thank the InfoWars crew for covering the South Carolina National Guard drills, the door-to-door wellness checks article that I did recently about the South Carolina National Guard doing door-to-door wellness checks. We covered this on the show, going across the state of South Carolina, knocking on doors just to make sure that people were okay. Of course, it was a drill. But it was acclimation drill, clearly, and we all know what wellness checks are. That's code for gun confiscation. That's code for forced relocation. That's code for the outright fascism of the military going door to door and enforcing dictates. So let's not forget that. So we thank them for covering it. Now, let's move on into the information that we're going to try to cover in depth this week, and that is the Syria situation. Got an article up, Human Rights Watch fail, uses photo of American bombing destruction to condemn Assad. Now, let's talk a little bit about Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch, we recently caught them in an attempt to basically fabricate evidence of Assad's use of barrel bombs in civilian areas, right? Because they wanted to demonize Assad even more. Now, on February 25th, we had Human Rights Watch posting a photo of a devastated civilian area in Syria, and they had the tagline that said, "Syria dropped barrel bombs despite ban." Now, the ban that Human Rights Watch is referring to is the ban on bombing civilian areas that apply to both sides in Aleppo after the United Nations stepped in to save their Western-backed terrorists from annihilation after Assad had surrounded the city and was preparing a siege. Assad's forces had also cut off a major supply route coming to the death squads from Turkey, so it was making this elimination of these death squads in Aleppo an inevitability. So the United Nations stepped in at the last minute. As soon as Assad cut off the supply route and as soon as Assad surrounded the city, they stepped in at the last minute to say, we want peace, we want a negotiation, we want a ceasefire. Of course, they never did that when the death squads had the upper hand. They only do that when Assad gets the upper hand. So let's read this article from the New York Times. This is Somini Sengupta on February the 24th. It said, Human Rights Watch said Tuesday that the Syrian government had dropped so-called barrel bombs on hundreds of sites in rebel-held towns and cities in the past year, flouting a United Nations Security Council measure. In a report released Tuesday, the group said it relied on satellite images, photos, and videos and witness statements to conclude that the Syrian government had bombarded at least 450 sites in and around the southern town of Dara and at least 1,000 sites in Aleppo in the north. The report focused on the period since February 22, 2014, when the Security Council specifically condemned the use of barrel bombs, which are large containers filled with explosives and projectiles that can indiscriminately hurt civilians and are prohibited under international law. Well, those chemical weapons that the death squads used, and the United Nations doesn't seem very interested in the death squads using chemical weapons. So's the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians. I don't see the United Nations too interested in stopping the death squads from doing that. Assad denies, by the way, that they're using barrel bombs, and I think they're using barrel bombs, but this is an attempt to kill death squad fighters, and generally they're dropped on areas that are wholly controlled by the death squad fighters. It's not something that's generally dropped into civilian areas. This is generally stuff that is sort of behind the lines of ISIS or the FSA, same thing. Now, here's the problem with the tweet by Human Rights Watch. The photograph that the organization provided was not Aleppo. The damage, in fact, the damage that had been shown in that photograph was not damage that was perpetrated by the Syrian military. It was damage that was created and put there by the United States. The photo was actually a picture of Kobane, also known as Ain al-Arab. Right? That's actually the Syrian name. The Arabic name, Kobane, is a Kurdish name. The city has obviously been the site of heavy aerial bombardment from the United States over the last several months, and the U.S. Has been engaged in death squad herding there. They've been engaged in geographical reformation of the territory of Syria and Iraq. But if you look at these tweets, which I've got embedded in my article, you'll see the picture. It's obviously the same place. And the Human Rights Watch tweet says Syria dropped barrel bombs despite ban, indicating this is Aleppo. Again, this is not Aleppo, and it wasn't done by the Syrian government. It was Kobane, and it was done by the United States. So apparently Human Rights Watch is content to use the destruction of the city as a reason to condemn Assad, and obviously to continue to promote the cause for U.S. military action in Syria. But Human Rights Watch is apparently much less interested in the exact same destruction wrought by U.S. forces. So that should tell you a little something about Human Rights Watch. So in other words, if Assad's forces bomb a civilian area into the Stone Age, it's an atrocity. It's a war crime. It's justification for international military involvement. If the United States bombs a civilian area into the Stone Age, well, no biggie, right? It's not that big a concern. Now, keep in mind, just a little more background on Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is partially funded by George Soros. Right, and it has repeatedly shielded for NATO and America's imperialism, particularly in Syria. When Western media propaganda had reached this crescendo regarding the outright lie that Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people, Human Rights Watch stood right beside Barack Obama and John Kerry the whole time in their effort to prove that Assad was guilty. Human Rights Watch even went so far as to repeat that lie and repeat the lie that the UN report suggested that Assad was the offending party. In other words, saying that the UN chemical weapons report said that Assad was guilty when it didn't. It didn't say that at all. And that in my opinion, that drove the final nail into the coffin of any credibility the Human Rights Watch organization may have had. But keep in mind also, in that same situation, when they had that last-minute chemical weapons deal that was secured by Russia so they could avoid another U.S. and NATO invasion of yet another country, Human Rights Watch did not go out and rejoice and celebrate the fact that we avoided another war, that we had this opportunity for peaceful destruction of chemical weapons and that sort of thing. Now, it actually came out and attacked the deal and claimed that the deal failed to ensure justice. Well, yeah, the deal did fail to ensure justice. There was no provisions demanding punishment of the death squads who actually used the weapons, and there were no provisions that had punishment for U.S. Or NATO governments that initiated and controlled these jihadists to begin with. So yeah, there was no justice. That did not ensure justice because the United States and NATO, who are responsible for every single act that takes place in Syria, by virtue of their creating the situation to begin with, then yeah, of course there was no justice because they weren't punished at all. Now, remember when we had Mother Agnes Mariam of the Cross, when she was releasing her report that refuted what the U.S. and NATO were saying in regards to the chemical weapons in Syria, she actually, of course, pointed out that a lot of the victims had been taken from another place inside Syria, and they were taken all the way to Ghouta and used basically as stage props. And her report is embedded in some of my articles, and you can also just Google her name and you'll see it. But when she was out speaking out about this situation, Human Rights Watch went out on this vicious campaign of attack against her and her report. You can even go back as far as 2009 and look at Human Rights Watch, and you see them showing their true colors when they actually signed off and supported renditions. Remember, renditions, that's the process of just kidnapping people off the street with no due process and rendering them to jails and prisons where they're tortured and all kinds of other nasty things happen to them, sometimes for years. The Human Rights Watch supports this procedure. They had secret talks with the Obama administration. This was reported in the mainstream press, and they realized they came out and said that there is a place for these programs. So if Human Rights Watch ever had any credibility in terms of the question of actual human rights, then all of that credibility has been lost, and it's been exposed as nothing more than a pro-U.S., pro-NATO NGO that acts as a smokescreen for the continuation of the violation of human rights across the world, of course, unless those violations are committed by America's enemies, and then they're human rights violations and they need international involvement, and that's that type of thing. Now, let's take a look at some more hypocrisy here. Got another article up. Qatar West says public statement by al-Nusra will wipe away jihadist sins. Go check that out up at Activist Post and BrandonTurbeville.com as well. So, I have been writing since the beginning of this Syrian crisis, I would say in late 2010, that there is no such thing as a moderate rebel in Syria, and I think we have made that case clearly. And I think that's been proven a million times over, right? That there are no moderate rebels in Syria. In fact, I would say that if such a thing as a moderate rebel actually exists in Syria, then we must, bring him forward for analysis, right? If it's such a rare and mysterious being, it must be thoroughly studied so we can determine if this is just a freak of nature or if there's more than one of them. Because this is important for science. This moderate rebel stuff, but apparently, according to the mainstream media, I don't understand how the process takes place in which a person becomes a rebel, or especially a moderate rebel. And that question, thankfully, has been answered by the Obama White House and the mainstream media organizations that work as domestic propaganda outlets, because the process, according to them, by which one becomes a moderate rebel versus a radical jihadist is not from the common sense messages of radical clerics, or because one of these guys are taking a stance against their totalitarian government, like we're being told. Apparently, you don't become a moderate rebel by joining Al-Qaeda or committing atrocities and imposing Sharia law. You become a moderate rebel by doing all those things, by joining Al-Qaeda, committing atrocities, imposing Sharia law, but stating that you don't belong to Al-Qaeda after you do it. That's how you become a moderate rebel, right? You at that point, you're fit to receive all the funding and training from the coffers of NATO and the GCC. Now, of course, I'm being sarcastic here and a little bit ridiculous, but that's the logic that's being used by the State Department and NATO, right, as well as its puppet governments in the Gulf. Qatar is now attempting to rebrand Jabhat al-Nusra as a moderate rebel brigade. This is the Syrian version of Al-Qaeda. Remember, we've talked about this on the show. Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda. This is official. They're Al-Qaeda. But because they're being offered the platform to say that they're not Al-Qaeda, and they don't have to change anything other than saying, yeah, we're not Al-Qaeda, and they can get funding from the GCC openly. Now, they're already getting funding from the GCC, and the United States is already supporting them, and the United States already controls them, but this is the question of whether or not they do this in the open, right? So Qatar is attempting to rebrand Jabhat al-Nusra as a moderate rebel brigade inside Syria, and so they can openly provide Nusra with relatively sophisticated weaponry and an amount of training as well as funding. Of course, now obviously they're doing that already, as I just mentioned, but this is going to be in a much more blatant fashion. So again, what is the requirement for the open arming of al-Nusra? The al-Nusra simply disavow its connections with Al-Qaeda. This all they have to do is say they're not a member of Al-Qaeda, even though they are Al-Qaeda. The next thing we know, we'll have Al-Qaeda come out and say that it's not Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda says, we're no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda, so we can get open funding and we'll be friends. So the suggestion that al-Nusra is a separate organization to begin with, that's a fraud. That's absolute falsehood. Again, al-Nusra is the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda in the same way Al-Qaeda in Iraq was the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda. The CFR, their news organization, Foreign Policy, was actually forced to admit that al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and you can go Google that to see that. There are a few establishment critics of the plan. We had the Sufan Group, that's a global security NGO. This is what they had to say. It says, an al-Nusra removed from Al-Qaeda on paper wouldn't mean an anti-Al-Qaeda al-Nusra at heart. The history of attempts to turn extremist groups into non-extremist, well-behaved proxies is riddled with failures and devastating blowbacks. Al-Nusra was formed to spread bin Ladenism into Syria, and its members are true adherents of that ideology. End quote. Yeah, blowbacks. That's the only thing. Whenever you hear blowback, you can translate that to be a cover-up, because blowback is it's at best it's a tepid criticism that goes nowhere. It essentially gives credence to the official story, which is why anybody who eschews 9/11 truth for blowback theory is absolutely, when you get down to the base level of intellectual thought here and debate and really what you are able to do in terms of seizing power and providing legitimate solutions, then you're useless, because it's all about the official story is true, and you essentially give the argument to the opposition, right? It's the same thing with ISIS, right? You say it's blowback because we're blowing up their countries. Well, the opposition can always respond, well, we're blowing up their countries because they're terrorist organizations, right? They want to do us harm. and that gives them a much bigger argument to respond with. The truth is, of course, that we're not bombing them because they want to do us harm. We're not really bombing them at all. We're bombing governments that are in our way in terms of geopolitical concerns and big corporate and banking concerns. But the truth is also that we're controlling these terrorist organizations. The United States controls these terrorist organizations and their proxy forces to begin with. All of them: ISIS, al-Nusra, FSA, Al-Qaeda. They're all the same thing. So you got to bear that in mind. Forget this idea of blowback. But again, U.S., Qatar, GCC, NATO, they've all been supporting Nusra all along. There's never been any need for Nusra to break away from Al-Qaeda to reap those benefits from Western aid. This is just, again, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Al-Qaeda proper have always been receiving funds from the West from the very beginning of the Syrian crisis and even as far back as the late 1970s. But what's funny, this is just an open PR kind of thing, but al-Nusra has even refused to do that, right? The AFP reports that Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate Al-Nusra Front on Monday reaffirmed its allegiance to the global extremist network and denied any plan to break away and become a more internationally acceptable rebel force. The angry statement followed weeks of speculation on internet social networks of a split between the jihadist allies. Al-Nusra completely denies reports of a breakup with Al-Qaeda, the group said in a statement released on Twitter. It said Al-Nusra remains the backbone of jihadists in Syria, the first into battle, dedicated to unifying the ranks around Sharia, righting injustice, and defending the disadvantaged. Well, that actually sounds a lot like the American slogans. But, end quote, by the way, this is, Al-Nusra couldn't even go out and disavow Al-Qaeda in the way that the PR firms would prefer them to do, so they could have this faux moderate rebel force on the ground there. So again, the idea that any verbal denunciation or formal declaration of opposition is going to change the fact that Nusra and Al-Qaeda are the same organization, that's irrational. But for the people who might easily be confused in regards to events that are taking place in Syria by all these name changes and shifting alliances, or allegedly shifting alliances, you got to remember that there are no moderate rebels inside Syria, and that the jihadist forces that are fighting in Syria, they're nothing more than small branches of the same organization, which itself is a creation of the United States and NATO. So that's sort of the basic idea, the basic premise that you've got to remember there. Now, in regards to the question of Iraq and ISIS and some of the events that have surrounded that, we need to look at this recent accusation by the United States against the Iraqi military of war crimes. This is important. Now, we had a relatively recent and largely successful battle for Tikrit, which was conducted by the Iraqi security forces, who are, of course, fighting the Western-backed ISIS fighters who've had control of the city for some time. Now, Iraq has once again been forced into the headlines of international media. This place has been in the headlines for over 10 years because probably even more than that, because of the behavior of the West. And all of this was instigated by the West. Never forget that. But we received claims of war crimes committed by the Iraqi security forces, which have been now pushed into the mainstream media reporting, and of course these claims have come from the West largely. So there's a number of questions that are surrounding the events on the ground and the manner in which they're being reported in the West that we have to look at closely in order to understand what's actually taking place. These events that take place in Iraq and Syria are generally reported, the way they're reported in the mainstream press, if they're reported at all, is just so convoluted and so murky and deceptive and just outright false that it's hardly fair to even blame any American for not fully understanding the details and the particulars of the Syrian crisis and the spread of ISIS and what's going on in Iraq, because the only information that they're really exposed to is an absolute lie. And unfortunately, even the so-called independent press is generally one step away from being major, from not even being, but one step away from the major corporations and intelligence agencies and banks and government propaganda wings than the open corporate media. These independent press agencies are also spinning the criticisms of the administration and the war in general, and using their own viewers' intellectual capacity against the viewer, against the average person, and judoing them back in the same direction as the mainstream media. And an example of this would be, these so-called independent researchers and analysts who are repeating this blowback theory, which is I talked about a second ago, that the blowback is the reason for ISIS's sudden appearance across the Middle East. That criticism of Washington seems radical for a lot of people, particularly those who are in the mainstream and maybe academics or something like that. But it's historically inaccurate, since it gives a pass for America's subsequent responses, right? And it's a complete cover-up of the hand that the West has played in intentionally fomenting color revolutions and destabilizations and terrorism across the world. I'll give you an example of one of these so-called independent researchers, one of these so-called, radicals, I guess we should call them, and that's Noam Chomsky. All right, Noam Chomsky. We'll spell his name Gnome. All right, Noam Chomsky. Noam vigorously adheres to blowback theory and claims that anybody who suggests that the United States is supporting ISIS is a conspiracy theorist, and that's an insult that has served this little prick well for his pathetic career over this many decades of being a left gatekeeper and being a defender of the Pentagon. Unfortunately, nobody in his audience is able to pick up on the fact that this rip-off artist is actually a rip-off artist. So yeah, no respect for GNOME on this radio program. But supporting ISIS, that's just what the United States is doing, whether GNOME wants to admit it or not. This idiot actually went out. Actually, that's saying too much. He's not an idiot. He's probably a smart man, but he obviously he's being used for a purpose, and this is why, right? We had GNOME coming out and saying that ISIS was defending the legitimate concerns of Sunni Muslims. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? ISIS is defending legitimate concerns of Sunni Muslims by what? Killing them, Noam? Did you wake up? Are you able to find Syria on a map? Because they're killing Sunni Muslims, my friend. And Sunni Muslims, both in Syria and Iraq, have joined militias and security forces in order to kill ISIS. So there's that for your legitimate concerns. They don't represent legitimate concerns. Is this what Noam Chomsky thinks that Sunni Muslims consider legitimate concerns? Sharia law, beheadings? So I really hate to belabor the point and stay on Noam Chomsky, because this is really this career will be ended by nature soon enough. But this legacy that he has of being some radical critic. The guy's not even an intellectual critic, right? He yaps and talks and prattles on for hours in these philosophical monologues, but he actually never really says anything, right? And I guess that makes the left feel good, because he talks like a professor. I think he did teach some classes, so they get their jollies that way, right? So he talks and talks and makes them feel smart. They don't actually know anything. Their head is filled with jumbled up ideas, and they can't really put their finger on what the opinion is. All they can do is go on subsequent monologues and repeat the occasional claim of GNOME. So if you're a follower of GNOME, you should stop it. You should look at GNOME's history, right? Noam Chomsky is constantly acted as a left gatekeeper for the Pentagon, for even the neocons, the humanitarian bombers, the responsibility to protect crowd. He's fought against 9/11 truth, tooth and nail. Anybody that doesn't agree with his typical Ford Foundation funded, Amy Goodman-ish, ideology is called a conspiracy theorist. And of course, that serves him well, like it serves people like Bill O'Reilly and other individuals. So, really got no use for Noam. Now, again, the United States is supporting ISIS, and it's doing what it has done since that organization changed its name from the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant and Al-Qaeda in Iraq about 3 years ago. So we won't go into too much detail about that. I've done that many times here on this show. Just go look up my article, The Roots of ISIS, and you can see that Noam Chomsky is full of shit. The Iraqi success in Tikrit, by the way. Excuse me, before we even go into that, I'll point out that the United States has been supporting, has been training, has been arming, and has been directing ISIS in Syria and Iraq since the beginning of the crisis. But I'll also point out that the bombs, because I know this is going to be returned to me as a criticism, but the United States is bombing ISIS in Syria and Iraq. These bombs are going against Syrian infrastructure in Syria. Grain silos, oil refineries, and that sort of thing. In Iraq, bombing goes toward death squad herding and essentially a persistent threat to the Iraqi government to prevent them from engaging with Iran anymore. So it's death squad herding in Iraq. It's destroying the Syrian government's infrastructure in Syria. Now, the Tikrit offensive. Let's talk about Tikrit. The Iraqi military and the Iraqi government and the United States had been in the planning stages of an assault against ISIS positions inside Iraq since January of this year. But despite all this so-called assistance coming from the most militarily advanced nation on the face of the earth, Iraqi officials were complaining that preparations for military plans were moving too slow or not moving at all. So for all intents and purposes, it seemed like the United States was not as interested in eliminating strategic strongholds of ISIS as it was pretending to be in its press conferences and international speeches. So what is interesting is the fact that months before any operations were launched, we had U.S. General Lloyd Austin, who's head of the U.S. military CENTCOM. He told the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. and Iraq were planning a summer offensive to retake Mosul and to cut supply lines to the ISIS fighters that control it. In other words, General Austin revealed the war plans before the actual operation took place. So he tipped off the potential targets to an upcoming military assault and created even greater odds for Iraqi forces to have to surmount. So let's look at this question of Iraqi war crimes, okay? We got to answer the question of whether or not the war crimes on the part of the Iraqi military actually occurred. Now, we've got photographic evidence and we've got alleged video footage depicting the commission of war crimes, and that seems to be true from what we can see. I mean, unless there's something seriously amiss, unless there's more video trickery, and we can't rule it out, of course. But let's work on the assumption that the war crimes were committed. The people who are responsible for those war crimes, that's more open to question. Obviously, the Iraqi military denies the claims. They claim that the ISIS fighters committed war crimes using Iraqi military uniforms so they could take photos and video for the purpose of providing propaganda against the Iraqi government. And that's entirely believable, right? That in other words, a false flag, that that ISIS fighters would have grabbed Iraqi military uniforms, committed war crimes, and videotaped themselves committing them, and then using that as propaganda against the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government says that the photos and videos were obviously a type of false flag that that were aimed at representing the security forces as horrendous and presumably sectarian. As the Iraqi security force spokesman stated, Iraqi military uniforms can be purchased at shops all across the country by civilians. So it's, even in war-torn Iraq, particularly if your organization is being backed by the most powerful nations on earth, like ISIS is, then access to military uniforms is, a fairly easy accomplishment, especially if they're being sold in shops. You've got access to these military uniforms. So it's not just because they had the uniforms doesn't mean that that's necessarily an indication that it was the Iraqi government. Now, considering the propaganda attempts made by ISIS with this with the assistance of U.S. and NATO, it may very well be the case that these photos in general may be staged, or at the very least that the individuals in the photos don't belong to the Iraqi military, but they belong to outside forces, whether it's ISIS or NATO. Now, this is not to say that the Iraqi military is incapable of committing war crimes. I think they can, obviously. This is not to say that they didn't commit war crimes in this instance, but it is to say that the possibility that these photos were staged certainly exists, and given NATO's past history, these odds are pretty high, and they're high enough to warrant an investigation into the possibility that the photos were a ploy to discredit and weaken the Iraqi military. Now, the timing of the war crimes photos and reports come as the U.S. dropped support for Iraqi security forces fighting ISIS, and this is very important. These photos and alleged videos come out at a time which the United States is clearly wary of an Iraqi government that is willing to cooperate with the Iranians on any level, and the revelation of the reports of the Iraqi military war crimes is very convenient, to say the least. This is because the reports will then provide plausible justification on the part of the United States to remove certain amounts of funding for the Iraqi security forces, as well as removing some needed arms and equipment. Now, it's obvious that the U.S. would prefer its own puppet regime in Iraq. In the absence of a total puppet regime, though, the United States and NATO will, without a doubt, settle for ISIS terrorist proxies, who wrest control of the country. The entire idea behind ISIS in Iraq was not only to provide a forward operating base for heavier warfare inside Syria, but also to destabilize the Maliki government, since Maliki was in favor of closer ties with Iran. Now, this is the reason that the U.S. and NATO wants to see ISIS continue its march across Iraq, right? Now, this is minus a march across strategic oil fields controlled by Western oil companies, of course, but ISIS can be used as a tool to keep Iraq weak and pliable, and to physically remove any government that exists in Baghdad that might resist the Anglo-American dictates. So even the Iraqi government recognizes this threat, whether Western audiences are too thick to understand it or not. In February of this year, Iraqi lawmaker Nala al-Hababi stated that the United States' purpose was to draw out the Iraqi-ISIS conflict for as long as possible. This is what Hababi stated. Quote, "The international coalition is not serious about airstrikes on ISIL terrorists and is even seeking to take out the popular voluntary forces from the battlefield against the Takfiris so that the problem with ISIL remains unsolved in the near future. The ISIL terrorists are still receiving aids from unidentified fighters and fighter jets in Iraq and Syria." Obviously, okay, end quote. But the United States and NATO have long been documented creators and directors and facilitators of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And again, go look at my article, The Roots of ISIS. Only recently, remember, the Iraqi military reportedly shot down a U.S. helicopter and 2 British planes that were allegedly dropping aid to ISIS. And so the idea that these war crimes claims would come out right at a time when the U.S. is seeking to actually bolster ISIS, or not even bolster them, but inhibit the ability of the Iraqi military from fighting ISIS, this is highly suspect, to say the least. Now, this is not breaking news anymore. We were right there on the cusp of it when it came out. But what else is important is that Syria recently, on March 17th, shot down a U.S. Predator drone over the northwestern city of Latakia in Syria. The United States confirmed that it lost contact with the drone, but it stated that it was not clear whether or not the drone had been shot down. It's not fully admitting that the drone was shot down. Syrian state media described the drone as hostile, but didn't give any further details. There are lots of reports that this drone obviously was armed, that it was flying over government facilities. The Sana news agency said that the Syrian air defense system shot down a U.S. unmanned aerial vehicle north of Latakia province. The Pentagon said it was looking into the incident, but we've got to note that some drones are used for reconnaissance. Predator drones are outfitted for reconnaissance, surveillance, and warfare. And this calls into question whether or not the drone, whether it was already a violation of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, was preparing to launch an airstrike against the Syrian government, or whether it may have been a provocation to coax the Syrian military into shooting it down. Now, going by Western reports so far, it appears that the former may have been more of the reason to do this, right? That it might have been actually going to launch an airstrike against the Syrian government, or whether or not it was openly, just flying over the Syrian airspace. Again, this is not ISIS-controlled territory. This is clearly government-controlled territory, and so there you have it. If it was a provocation to coax the Syrian military into shooting it down, then most likely we would have heard much more about it in the Western media, because the U.S. has been looking for just about any justification it can get so it can take direct military action in Syria. Now, this drone the downing of the drone will mark the first time in both Syrian and U.S. military, since the Syrian crisis, the first time the Syrian and U.S. military proper have clashed, and I guess we have Syria 1, U.S. 0 on that, but that kind of situation was bound to happen since the U.S. just afforded itself the right to bomb targets inside Syria a year ago. And remember, in February, the U.S. announced that it was going to allow phantom moderate rebels, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra fighters, to call in airstrikes against their opponents. And that essentially makes the U.S. officially Al-Qaeda's air force. So who do you think these fighters are going to call in airstrikes against? Themselves? Anyway, the shoot-down of the drone comes as the United States and its proxy forces are accusing the Syrian government of using chemical weapons again in Idlib province. No evidence at all, just John Kerry shooting off his big horse-face mouth. So, that's what we have there. Speaking of John Kerry, I think we should address this, and we're going to run out of time before I get to everything that I wanted to get to, unfortunately. But I want to address the terrible reporting of the mainstream and, unfortunately, the alternative media regarding John Kerry and his statement. There's been hysteria around John Kerry's remarks regarding the necessity of negotiating with Bashar al-Assad, and it's provoked criticism from the neocon, warmonger, right, Republican crowd who is ready to go to war with everybody, everywhere, all the time, no matter who, except Israel. It's provoked praise from the it's also provoked criticism from the humanitarian bombers and their responsibility to protect leftists who see going in and slaughtering millions of people as an act of promoting democracy and human rights. It's received praise, unfortunately, from a number of different quarters in the independent media and the alternative media, saying that finally John Kerry is realizing that this foolish adventure in Syria is wrong and that we're going to have to negotiate with Assad, and this is the United States backing off of its position. Well, they're all wrong. Let's look at the quote. This is Kerry's statement to Margaret Brennan of Face the Nation. Right? Kerry said this: "We are working very hard with other interested parties to see if we can reignite a diplomatic outcome. Why? Because everybody agrees that there is no military solution. There is only a political solution. But to get the Assad regime to negotiate, we're going to have to make it clear to him that there is a determination by everybody to seek that political outcome and change his calculation about negotiating. That's underway right now. And I am convinced that with the efforts of our allies and others, there will be increased pressure on Assad. Brennan then says, and you'd be willing to negotiate with him? Kerry says, well, we have to negotiate in the end. So that's the quote that is causing so much consternation. Now, immediately after the remarks, we had the mainstream press going into overdrive suggesting that John Kerry and the United States were making concessions to Assad. We had headlines like this, like Kerry willing to talk to Assad to stem violence in Syria, coming from PBS. We had Breitbart, of course, saying, Kerry, U.S. will have to recognize Syrian dictator Assad. State Department walks back assertion. Well, that's Breitbart for you. That totally was not what he said at all. And then we have the International Business Times, U.S. will negotiate with Assad, says Kerry, on 4th anniversary of Syrian civil war. So you could scarcely blame people for looking at these headlines and seeing Kerry's statement as anything but a change of policy. But unfortunately for the alternative media, they follow suit as well. And, this is... They went off on this same information, and they expressed praise because their perspective is that this is a surprise, and they're satisfied that this is a possibility of war avoidance now. But all you got to do is read Kerry's statement a little bit further, and you see that this is not war avoidance. And this is particularly why you don't read a headline and then judge an entire article or entire issue based on a headline that you read on Facebook. So stop doing that. You're doing yourself a disservice, and you're doing a disservice to your readers if that's what you're doing. So, Skull and Bones John Kerry, he never said that the United States must recognize Assad as the legitimate leader of Syria. He did not suggest that the U.S. is backing away on their strategy of destabilization or proxy invasion. What Kerry said was what Kerry has been saying all along, and that is that Assad must go. Now, you got to note that Kerry also said that the United States would be willing to negotiate with Assad's government, quote, if he's ready to have a serious negotiation about the implementation of Geneva I. What's Geneva I? That's the agreement reached by the International Group of Governments in 2012 that sought to force a political transition with Assad stepping down. He's saying he will negotiate with Assad if Assad is willing to step down. Now, after all these raving Republicans came out and criticized the State Department, saying that it's a capitulation, and then the State Department wheeled out these harpies, these horrible women, these humanitarian bombers, and responsibility to protect leftists like Marie Harf and Jen Psaki. These the spokeswomen would have had to respond. All right, this is what Psaki says: as we have long said, Assad must go and be replaced through a negotiated political transition that is representative of the Syrian people. Marie Harf actually said the same thing. She wanted to clear up Kerry's comments by pointing out that the U.S. policy toward Syria has not changed and that Assad would not be part of any negotiations. So how much clearer can they be? They're saying that's not what he meant. We want Assad to go. On March 17th, we had a top U.S. envoy and the ISIS czar. Remember General John Allen, who was fired for possibly giving away secret information? Right. This is one of the guys who was involved in the Paula Broadwell scandal, but now he's the ISIS czar. He says the U.S. does want a negotiated peace settlement in Syria, but he wants one that excludes Bashar al-Assad. We've also got statements from the U.S. Embassy in Ankara in Turkey that make this clear. This is what Reuters reports. Quote, General Allen reiterated the United States' position on Assad has not changed. The U.S. Embassy in Ankara said in a statement after Allen, the special envoy responsible for building the anti-Islamic State coalition, held talks in Ankara. The United States believes that he has lost all legitimacy to government, that conditions in Syria under his rule have led to the rise of ISIL and other terrorist groups, and that we continue to seek a negotiated political outcome to the Syrian conflict that does not in the end include Assad. Allen held constructive talks with Turkish Foreign Minister Undersecretary Feridun Sinirlioglu late on Tuesday and welcomed Turkey's support in the training of vetted members of Syria's opposition, the statement said. End quote. So, in addition to Allen's statements, we got to mention that Kerry's statement referred to his being convinced that there will be increased pressure on Assad to step down. This is what he said. He says, it may require that there be increased pressure on him of various kinds in order to do that. We made it very clear to people that we are looking at increased steps that can help bring about that pressure. Now, that pressure that he's referring to can take a variety of means. There's continued arming and funding and training and directing of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and al-Nusra. It could refer to political pressure. It could refer to further U.S.-led bombing efforts against Syrian infrastructure. All of these things the United States is currently engaged in. But also military pressure. Remember, March 5th, Kerry referenced the possibility that military pressure may be needed to oust Assad. This is what Kerry said. Ultimately, a combination of diplomacy and pressure will be needed to bring about a political transition. Military pressure particularly may be necessary given President Assad's reluctance to negotiate seriously. He's lost any semblance of legitimacy, but we have no higher priority than disrupting and defeating Daesh and other terror networks. So, he made those statements in Saudi Arabia's Riyadh Air Base at a meeting with the Gulf foreign ministers. You don't make the mistake of believing that the United States is interested in peaceful settlements or that they're capitulating to their enemies of their own making. John Kerry's statements are not legitimizing Assad. They are not legitimizing him as the rightful Syrian leader, and they are not an overture for peace. They are an affirmation of the West attack on Syria and Assad, and it's a statement that, if nothing else, reaffirms the stance that the U.S. and NATO have had since the beginning of the crisis, which is that Assad must go, and that military pressure, military force is on the table. This is the opposite of what, unfortunately, the alternative media has presented this as being. This is war talk, not peace talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish we could get to the other topics that I wanted to touch on, the mandatory voting, and we had some more stuff with Putin and Iran, but we'll get to that next week. So stay with us. Come back next week. This is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
The Anti-Media Radio with your host Nick Burnby here on UCY.tv.
For more news, visit PaidMyNews.com.